Clint Eastwood stood in the first-class line, his rugged simplicity a striking contrast to the luxury that surrounded him. Behind him, a man watched with a smirk, his arrogance impossible to hide. What happened next would leave every passenger on that plane completely speechless and change one life forever. In Man Insults, Clint Eastwood on a first-class flight instantly regrets it when the truth is revealed. Discover how a quiet legend turned judgment into a humbling lesson no one saw coming. The first-class lounge at LAX was alive with energy. Business executives paced on urgent phone calls, couples clinked glasses of champagne, and exhausted travelers lounged in oversized leather chairs. Amid this luxury stood a man who exuded calmness. Clint Eastwood, dressed in a well-worn leather jacket, faded jeans, and a weathered hat, he looked like he belonged anywhere but here. Yet his presence commanded the room in a way few could. Behind him, Mark Wilder, a sharply dressed hedge fund manager, watched with a smirk. Mark prided himself on his appearance, his tailored suit, his gleaming watch, and the unmistakable scent of money. To him, Clint was a relic, out of place, out of style, and certainly out of his league. Mark leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "First class, huh? Guess they'll let anyone in these days." Clint glanced back, his expression calm, his eyes sharp. "Seems that way," he replied simply. Mark chuckled to himself, smug and self-assured. What he didn't realize was that this would be a flight he would never forget. Clint Eastwood stood out in more ways than one. With his rugged leather jacket and scuffed boots, he looked like a man who had just walked off the set of a Western, rather than someone waiting for a first-class boarding call. But there was an aura about him, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention yet inevitably drew it. Mark Wilder, on the other hand, was the polar opposite. His expensive tailored suit hugged him like armor, his glossy shoes reflected the bright airport lights, and his designer briefcase seemed to serve as a trophy for his success. Mark thrived on appearances, and to him Clint's understated presence was almost an insult. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Mark couldn't resist another jab. "Let's hope the seats are as outdated as your outfit," he muttered, loud enough for Clint to hear. Clint didn't react. He simply adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and made his way to the boarding gate, his calmness only fueling Mark's irritation. But the surprises didn't stop there. As fate would have it, the seating chart had placed Mark directly next to Clint in the first-class cabin. Mark's smirk quickly faded when he saw Clint settling into the seat beside his. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Passengers began filing in, and the flight attendants made their rounds. But Mark's focus was fixed on Clint. He leaned over, still unable to hide his disbelief. "So, what do? You don't exactly look like the first-class type." Clint, unbothered, responded with a slight smile. "I work in film." Mark raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Film, huh? What kind? Indie stuff? You don't seem like someone who's made it big." Clint didn't elaborate, his composure unshaken. "Something like that," he said. Mark chuckled to himself, convinced he'd figured Clint out. To him, Clint was just another nobody trying to play with the big leagues. What he didn't know was that the man sitting next to him had already made his mark on the world, many times over. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the skies, the tension between Clint and Mark began to simmer. While the other passengers settled into their seats, enjoying the luxuries of first class, Mark's attention stayed firmly fixed on Clint. The in-flight service began, with flight attendants offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Mark, ever the showman, leaned back in his seat and gestured grandly. "Champagne for me. Only the best," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. When it was Clint's turn, his request was simple. Just water, please. Mark couldn't resist another comment. Water? That's all you're getting in first class. Come on, live a little. Clint smiled politely and took the bottle from the flight attendant. I'm fine with this, he said. Sometimes simple is best. Mark let out a low chuckle. Yeah, sure. That's what people say when they're not used to this kind of lifestyle. His tone was sharp, laced with the kind of condescension he reserved for those he believed were beneath him. Clint didn't respond. He took a sip of his water and turned his attention to the window, seemingly uninterested in continuing the conversation. But Mark wasn't done yet. You know, he said, leaning closer to Clint, people work hard to get into first class. It's not just handed out. I mean, I get it if this is some kind of special occasion for you. Maybe you cashed in some miles, huh? A few passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, their ears catching Mark's increasingly pointed remarks. Clint, however, remained calm. He turned back to Mark, his gaze steady and unreadable. Everyone's journey is different, he said simply. The response caught Mark off guard. He blinked, unsure how to reply. For a moment he felt as though Clint had seen right through him, stripping away his bravado to reveal something deeper. But instead of reflecting, Mark doubled down. Maybe so, Mark said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But let's be honest, some people just don't belong here. The cabin grew quieter as Mark's words hung in the air. Other passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some clearly recognizing Clint, but staying silent out of respect. Clint, as always, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, a faint smile playing on his lips, and said, Well, I suppose that's one way to see the world. Mark smirked, believing he'd won the exchange, but little did he know the tables were about to turn, and in a way he could never have expected. As the flight continued, Mark's confidence seemed to grow. He relished the attention of nearby passengers, some of whom couldn't help but overhear his not-so-subtle remarks. To him, Clint was nothing more than an easy target, a man who didn't belong in the luxury of first class. Mark leaned back in his seat, sipping his champagne with a self-satisfied grin. You know, he began again, his voice loud enough to carry, it's fascinating how some people get here. Connections, maybe. Luck. It's not every day you see someone so... He paused, his eyes scanning Clint's worn leather jacket. So down to earth in a place like this. Clint didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his gaze steady and calm. But before he could respond, a flight attendant approached with a polite smile. Mr. Eastwood, she said warmly, the captain wanted to let you know that your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards and says he's a big fan of your work. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The surrounding passengers, who had been quietly observing, suddenly looked up, their eyes widening. Mark froze, his smug expression faltering as the realization hit him. Wait, Eastwood, Mark stammered, the color draining from his face. Clint Eastwood. Clint nodded politely at the flight attendant, thanking her for the message before turning his attention back to Mark. Is something wrong? Clint asked, his voice calm but laced with quiet amusement. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced around the cabin, realizing that the passengers who had overheard their exchange were now staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and judgment. I didn't know it was you, Mark finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter who I am? Clint asked, his tone gentle but firm. Would it have changed the way you treated me? Mark's face turned crimson. He fumbled for a response but found none. The silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the occasional clink of a glass or the rustle of a newspaper. One of the nearby passengers, a middle-aged man, leaned over to whisper to his wife, I knew it was him. Can you believe the nerve of that guy? Mark sank deeper into his seat. his earlier arrogance now replaced by a growing sense of shame. He had spent the entire flight belittling a man he now realized was not only famous, but widely respected for his achievements and character. And the worst part, Clint hadn't needed to say or do anything to prove his worth. His silence, his calm demeanor, and his quiet strength had spoken louder than any words ever could. Mark sat in stunned silence, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His mind raced with regret, replaying every word he'd said to Clint. The man he'd dismissed, belittled, and mocked turned out to be someone whose accomplishments dwarfed anything Mark had ever done. As the plane soared over the Pacific, Mark finally worked up the courage to speak. He turned to Clint, his voice hesitant and filled with embarrassment. "Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I didn't know who you were. If I had—" Clint cut him off with a slight shake of his head and a calm smile. "It's not about who I am, Mark," he said. "It's about who you are. The way you treat people says more about you than it ever will about them." Mark's eyes widened as the words sank in. For the first time in a long time, he was forced to reflect on his behavior, not just on this flight, but throughout his life. He had always been so consumed with proving his worth through wealth and status that he'd forgotten the simple value of respect and humility. "I've spent years chasing success," Mark admitted quietly, "trying to be the best, to stand out. But I guess I forgot that it doesn't mean much if you're stepping on people along the way." Clint nodded, his gaze steady. "Success is a fine goal, Mark, but it's empty if it doesn't come with integrity. In the end, it's not the money, the titles, or the first-class seats that define us. It's how we make others feel." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of Clint's words hitting him like a freight train. He thought of the countless times he'd dismissed, judged, or looked down on others. And for what? To feel superior? To prove a point? It all seemed so small now. "I don't even know where to start," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint smiled softly, leaning back in his seat. "Start by being better tomorrow than you were today. That's all anyone can do." The plane cabin was quiet, save for the hum of the engines. Nearby passengers, many of whom had been silently rooting for Clint, exchanged approving glances. Even those who hadn't recognized him before now seemed to feel the gravity of his words. Mark nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking through his embarrassment. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, yet welcome, a glimmer of hope that he could change. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange were no longer focused on the luxury around them, but on the quiet lesson that had unfolded. Mark sat in thoughtful silence, glancing occasionally at Clint, who seemed perfectly at ease. For the first time, Mark felt no resentment, no need to prove himself. Instead, he felt gratitude for the unexpected encounter that had opened his eyes. Once the plane landed, passengers began to disembark. Clint stood up, retrieving his worn leather bag from the overhead compartment. Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice steady but humble. "Thank you. For everything. I mean it." Clint turned to him with a small smile, his eyes kind but knowing. "It's never too late to start treating people the way they deserve to be treated, Mark. Take care of yourself." With that, Clint stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the exit. As he moved through the terminal, a small crowd of fans quickly recognized him, their faces lighting up with excitement. Clint greeted them warmly, taking a few moments to shake hands and sign autographs before disappearing into the bustling airport. Mark watched from a distance, his mind still racing. The man he had judged so harshly had taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. That true greatness doesn't need to be flaunted, and respect costs nothing but is worth everything. As Mark walked through the terminal, he felt lighter, as though a burden had been lifted. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to change. And it all started with a single humbling encounter on a first-class flight. Sometimes the people we judge the most harshly are the ones who teach us the most profound lessons. Clint Eastwood didn't need to raise his voice or throw around his name to make an impact. His actions, his calm demeanor, and his unwavering respect for others spoke louder than anything else ever could. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time, like and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us of the power of kindness and humility.